Chapter 8, Part 1 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 1, edited by Charles Louis Meryon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Part 1. Dismissing these personal details, which have been mentioned solely as connecting links of the main narrative, I now resume my diary. July 7th. I returned to Darjeeling. July 8th. The day after my arrival, before breakfast, Lady Hester Stanhope being yet in bed, a servant came for me. "I hope I have not disturbed you," said she, when I entered her room. "But I wanted you just for a minute to say a word about Logmagi, whom I am going to send home for a week or two. Poor man! He is all devotedness to my service, but I must not ride a willing horse to death. He's liberal-minded, too, and charitable, not as your fine my lord is, who gives his 5 guineas to a somebody and never feels the loss of his money, but one who, if he sees an old captain that he has known in his younger days, or one of his messmates in distress, will pull off his cloak, aye, and his jacket too, and give them to him. When he hears anyone praise me, his purse is open to him immediately." It is necessary that I should introduce my readers to this person, who played a very conspicuous part in Lady Hester Stanhope's establishment, from the year 1832 until and after this my second visit to her in 1837 and 1838. It has already been related that in returning to Europe in 1832, I took a passage from Sidon to Cyprus in a boat of the country called a shaktur, better known as a tartan lower down the Mediterranean. The master of this boat was a cheerful, good-looking fellow named Hassan el Logmagi, or Hassan the Diver, so called from his first outset in life as a sponge diver. At the period when I engaged him, his employment lay in the coasting trade from Sidon to Beirut, Tripoli, Tyre, and the neighboring ports. In the course of his motley existence he had been a porter, a fisherman, a diver, a common sailor, a slave, and a trader in small goods, visiting almost every port in the Mediterranean and archipelago, buying at one what would sell at another, and thus become acquainted with many maritime cities of Turkey. Shortly subsequent to the date of his carrying us to Cyprus, Abdallah Pasha made him captain of an armed vessel in his service, and he then was entitled fully to the rank of Rais Hassan, or Captain Hassan, which he always afterwards bore. Lady Hester Stanhope was accustomed to obtain information from all sorts of persons as it suited her purpose, and feeling some interest about our welfare after quitting her, she sent for Hassan, on his return to Sidon, to learn the particulars of the voyage. It would seem that his appearance and conversation pleased her, for as soon as Abdallah Pasha was carried off a prisoner to Egypt, she took him into her service. His person and manners were those of a handsome boatswain. He was boisterous and rude, entirely without education, for he could neither read nor write, but very shrewd, and from his varied intercourse with mankind a keen judge of character, at least of the dark side of human nature. He was jovial in the highest degree, remarkably good-looking, and for a day's acquaintance, when matters of interest were out of the question, Nobody who wished to be merry could desire a pleasanter fellow. Sinbad the sailor could not tell a more marvelous story. It was matter of much surprise to the Europeans of Beirut, and the natives in general, how such a man could be admitted for hours to Lady Hester Stanhope's conversation and the enjoyment of her intimate confidence. And it was a great marvel to all Sidon, Logmoggy's native place, and where, of course, his antecedents, as the French say, were well known, how he could have obtained so firm a footing where so many before him had slipped. The reason will be seen in the course of these pages, abundantly verifying what Lady Hester very often said, that it was in vain for people to attempt to investigate or speculate upon her motives for what she did, and that, if two people were placed in her room, one in one corner and one in the other, all day long, she would manage her business in their presence so that they should be no wiser in the matter than if they had been a mile off. Her intentions, she would say, were pure, but God only was the judge of that, and she cared not a fig what men thought. So it was, and on my arrival in Syria, I found Logmoggy installed as purveyor, steward, emissary, and factotum. All transactions with the people of the country were carried on through his hands, and a most important part of his avocations was to keep Lady Hester constantly informed of all sorts of matters going on in Sidon and the surrounding country. Anecdotes of domestic affairs, of the government, news of every description formed his budget every time he came up to June, and for this purpose about half his time was spent in town to be able to collect it. He was married, had 2 wives, and was building a new house, principally at her ladyship's expense. The secret of Logmoggy's influence with Lady Hester might perhaps be traced to her reliance upon his apparent zeal in her service. She believed him to be thoroughly devoted to her, a belief which he well knew how to foster and sustain. He was too clever a courtier to eulogize her to her face, and therefore always made his advances by indirect means. He had been sent by her to Marseilles, to Constantinople, and to other distant places, and according to Lady Hester's account of what he told her on his return, there was not a person he came in contact with but had related some history of the Sultan's admiration of her, and of the Grand Vizier's apprehension of her political influence, of the extent of her reputation, even in the very bazaars, and of 100 similar things calculated to flatter her vanity and love of fame. At Beirut, at Tripoli, at Alexandria, he was sure to have met with a Tartar or a sea captain in some coffee-house, who said he had seen a pasha, or a great merchant, or a sheik, or a somebody who had declared he should not die contented if he had not once beheld a woman of such extraordinary talents, or who had been so munificent to some distressed aga, or who had relieved with such a liberal hand some learned dervice. And after having praised her charitable heart, he generally finished with a tale of distress of some family reduced almost to beggary, of some honest tradesman who wanted relief, and thus, striking the chords which always vibrated to Lady Hester's generous heart, he was entrusted with large sums to distribute. He seldom went down to Sidon without being the bearer of 1, 2, 3, nay, 5,000 piastres at a time to purchase provisions with and to give away in donations. Lady Hester had at this time in her service 35 persons. There was one Arabic secretary, an upper bailiff, 3 under ones, 2 men cooks, 2 porters, 1 for each gate, 3 grooms, 2 muleteers, 2 ass drivers, whose sole occupation was fetching water from the spring, and occasionally an extra one, 4 maids and a girl for herself, 3 boys, and 8 men servants. She had 2 mares which were never ridden, 1 horse for my riding, and 5 asses, also never used, as having completed a certain stated period of service and being now placed on the superannuated list. There was a mule also, which was never allowed to be worked, except by certain servants, and even then only on her ladyship's special commission, for some reason connected with its star. It was afterwards given to Monsieur Guy. The remainder of the stock consisted of 3 cows and a flock of sheep. Formerly, a herd of goats had been kept, 100 in number, but their throats were all ordered to be cut in one day, for some cause which I never clearly understood, but with the intention of defeating a scheme of the goatherds, who had been detected in turning their flesh and milk to his own account. And this slaughter, she told me, was made in imitation of her cousin, Lord Camelford, whose energetic character and abhorrence of knavery she greatly admired. It was, no doubt, also in emulation of his lordship's example, that if she ever discovered that any of her domestic animals had been put to any use contrary to her orders, she instantly had them shot, issuing her mandate at the same time that the human delinquents should be, at a moment's notice, turned adrift. There were also 3 amblers in the stables. These horses, very common in Syria, are trained by tying leaden weights to their legs until their trot becomes a run. Soon after my arrival, Lady Hester signified to me that she should have them shot, for her under bailiffs did nothing but ride them when they ought to go on foot, and moreover treated them cruelly. Accordingly, Osman Chaush, an under bailiff, who always carried a silver-headed stick in his hand, the emblem of the office of Chaushes, of whom many are kept in the employ of pashas as a sort of police officer, was commissioned to be their executioner. He received his orders from Lady Hester herself to this effect. Osman, you will say to each horse, before you shoot him, putting your mouth close to his ear, "You have now worked enough on the earth. Your mistress fears you might fall in your old age into the hands of cruel men, and she therefore dismisses you from her service." This order, strange as it may appear, was actually executed to the letter with imperturbable gravity. Lady Hester's mysterious ways had given her an extraordinary ascendancy over the minds of her people, and the Syrians, who are credulous, like all Eastern nations, were generally disposed to believe that her ladyship really did possess those undefined powers which are assigned to demonology and magic. That she herself believed in the transmigration of souls she frequently avowed, and her faith in aerial spirits also admits of no doubt. Throughout Syria, and I believe the whole Ottoman Empire, the belief in magic and charms is universal. There is not a single person who does not resort to some means for counteracting the effect of the evil eye, such as spells by written papers, enchantments, and the like. Impotence, estrangement of affection, the murrain in cattle, blight in fruit trees, anything the cause of which is not immediately obvious, is universally accounted for by witchcraft. Lady Hester, indeed, had imbibed all these notions, and to judge from the substance of many conversations she held on the subject, no reasonable doubt can be entertained of the startling fact that she placed implicit faith in them. Astrology, she would say, is confined to the influence of the stars over people's birth and actions, but magic has to do with the devil. Sometimes it is by compact, as when for a certain price I say, for example, to an evil spirit, "If you will tell me what they have written from the Porte to Abdallah Pasha, I will do so and so." Or if by means which I know to be powerful enough to bring devils under my command, I say to them, "You must do this and that and the other," they are obliged to obey, or I annihilate them. There are persons, she continued, who can write charms, by which they can effect the most diabolical purposes, but their charms are sometimes baffled by higher influences. I am an example. My star, more powerful than that on which they rely, renders their magic useless. So far, there is a connection between astrology and magic. But take care, doctor, there are men here who will slip a paper into your pocket unknown to you, and make you an idiot or blind or 100 things. Always keep at a distance from Girius Gamal. That man is an agent of the devil. Why, do you know that a woman's evil eye once fell upon me? I felt a strange pricking just above my knee, and soon after there appeared, first an oval black rim, then a bluish ground within it, and then a black spot in the center, so that any one might have said, "There is an eye." After a few days it disappeared. There was a man near Kara, between Damascus and Aleppo, who possessed the faculty of the evil eye so strongly that he could kill a person when he chose to use his power to the utmost. Now, all this, the reader will say, looks like the grossest credulity. But setting aside the observation that the greatest men among the ancients, as we know from their writings, entertained a similar creed, and that many eminent philosophers and jurisconsults, as Lord Bacon and Sir Matthew Hale, were actuated by similar convictions, it may be conjectured that Lady Hester Stanhope knew very well what a powerful weapon was this superstition placed in the hands of those who understood how to make use of it. Whether premeditatedly or not, she more than once brought crafty and designing knaves into signal disrepute by attributing to them dealings of this sort, and thus punished or kept in awe those whose villainous machinations it might be impossible to detect, but of which there was little doubt, even though not tangible by the hand of justice. Lady Hester Stanhope once built a new room, and just before she was going to inhabit it, from some cause, imagined or pretended to imagine, it was charmed. We may judge of the builder's surprise when she sent for him and said, "Tomorrow you must assemble your workmen and pull down the new room." The man, fancying some defect had been discovered in his workmanship, humbly begged her to say what it was that moved her displeasure, as perhaps he might be able to find a remedy for it without destroying the whole. "Your business, sir," answered Lady Hester, in that tone of voice which she made so terrible when she chose, "is to pull down if I like it, I suppose, as well as to build. So be so good as to obey my orders without further question." "When they were removing the arch of the door, doctor," said Lady Hester, who related the story to me, "I saw a paper fall out. I took it up and sent it to a man versed in charms. He told me it was a charm written by one of my deadly enemies, and if I had dwelt in the room I should have died. Only think how lucky it was I did what I did. Another time, when I had been ill in bed for some weeks, I happened to be looking out from under my eyelids. As you know, I have got a way of seeing everything when people think I see nothing, and I observed Gyrius Gamal fumble a paper between his fingers and dip it into a glass of lemonade that the slave was going to give me. I said nothing, but merely desired the slave to set the glass down. Had I drunk it, I have no doubt I should have been his victim. He is a terrible fellow. I warn you never to go to the village or take your family there, because I am afraid he would do some of you some harm. I don't know how he might do it. He might slip a paper into your boot, or sprinkle a few drops of water on your clothes and utter some incantation, for they have 100 ways of inflicting maledictions. It may be as well to add here, although not occurring at this time, that on reading an article in a newspaper to her about vampires, she said, "I believe in vampires, but the people in England know not how to distinguish them. Such a being is not a mere creation of people's fancies." From these, and a variety of other observations which will be found scattered through these memoirs, Lady Hester's professed opinions on the subject of charms and supernatural agency generally cannot be mistaken. Nor, indeed, seeing how she mixed up such opinions with the actual business of life, allowing them to exercise a direct practical influence over her conduct in numerous instances, can there be any reason for supposing that she did not entirely believe in them, to all intents and purposes, as sincerely as the Syrians themselves? But I leave the consideration of this curious problem to the sagacity of the reader, limiting my more appropriate province to the simple record of her ladyship's actual life and conversations. To return from this digression, it might be supposed that immediately upon my arrival, Lady Hester would have opened the urgent business upon which she had summoned me. No such thing. After congratulating me upon my escape from Europe, which she assured me would soon be convulsed by revolutions from one end to the other, she entered at once on her favorite topic, the coming of the Murda. But as her opinions and proofs were pretty much the same as those she had entertained 6 years before, and which have already been related, it is not necessary to recapitulate them. July 9th. In the afternoon, I rode down to Mar Elias to see my family, and returned the following day to dinner. July 10th. Lady Hester this day asked me if I had ever known Beau Brummel. I should like to see that man again, doctor," continued she, without waiting for my answer. "He was no fool. I recollect his once saying to me in Bond Street, riding with his bridle between his forefinger and thumb, as if he held a pinch of snuff, 'Dear creature, who is that man you were talking to just now?' 'Why,' I answered, 'that is Colonel Blank.' 'Colonel what?' said he, in his peculiar manner. 'Who ever heard of his father?' So I replied, 'And who ever heard of George B.'s father?' 'Ah, Lady Hester,' he rejoined half seriously, 'who indeed ever heard of George B.'s father? And who would ever heard of George B. himself, if he had been anything but what he is? But you know, my dear Lady Hester, it is my folly that is the making of me. If I did not impertinently stare duchesses out of countenance and nod over my shoulder to a prince, I should be forgotten in a week. And if the world is so silly as to admire my absurdities, you and I may know better. But what does that signify? 3 of the wits of the day in my time," observed Lady Hester, continuing the conversation, "were Mr. Hill, Captain Ash, and Mr. Brummel, all odd in their way, the one for dry wit, the other for solemn joking, and the last for foppery. Mr. Hill, for example, when at dinner at somebody's house, would draw towards him a dish of mashed potatoes that had a mould mark on them, as if he was going to help himself. Then, eyeing it with irresistible gravity, and looking at it very oddly with his quizzing glass, he would turn to the servant and say, 'I wish you would tell the housekeeper, my good fellow, not to sit down on the dishes,' pretending that he saw a mark as if she had sat down upon it. Brummel would commit similar freaks at the houses of parvenus, or people who were not exactly of haute tout, where sometimes at dinner he would all of a sudden make horridly ludicrous grimaces, as if he had found a hair in his soup, or would abruptly ask for some strange Palmyran sauce, or any out-of-the-way name that nobody ever heard of, and then pretend he could not eat his fish without it. As a specimen of Brummel's audacious effrontery, Lady Hester said that once, in the midst of a grand ball, he asked the Duchess of Rutland, 'In heaven's name, my dear Duchess, what is the meaning of that extraordinary back of yours? I declare I must put you on a backboard. You must positively walk out of the room backwards, that I mayn't see it.' Another time he marched up to Lady Hester, who was remarkable for the fine turn of her cheek, and the set of her head upon her neck, and coolly took out her earrings, telling her she should not wear such things, meaning that they hid the best part of her face. Upon one occasion he went about in a ballroom, asking everybody where he could find a partner who would not throw him into a perspiration, and at last crying out, 'Ah, there she is! Yes, Catherine will do. I think I may venture with her.' And this was the Duchess of Rutland's sister. Sometimes he would have a dozen dukes and marquises waiting for him, whilst he was brushing his teeth or dressing himself, and would turn round with the utmost coolness and say to them, 'Well, what do you want? Don't you see I'm brushing my teeth?' all the while slowly moving his brush backward and forward across his mouth, and hawking and spitting. And then he would cry, 'Oh, there's a spot! Ah, it's nothing but a little coffee. Well, this is an excellent powder, but I won't let any of you have the receipt for it." On one occasion she spoke of Mr. B. in terms of regard, and said she should write to him as a fellow sufferer like herself from fallen greatness. "I shall tell him I understand the bedgown is in existence," alluding to his taste in dressing gowns when he was a friend of the Prince of Wales. "When he receives my letter, he will say, 'There she is again, the dear creature, always the same.'" For I had said I had seen him once or twice at Calais, dressed very quietly and very much like a gentleman, with no appearance of foppery, except when he leaned out of his lodging window in a sort of a fine chintz dressing-gown. "Ah!" cried Lady Hester, "those are the patterns that the prince sometimes used to give £100 for, to have them like his." There was a gentleman who visited Lady Hester Stanhope on Mount Lebanon, Mr. H., who, she said, would not be an unworthy successor of Mr. Brummel. She called him a gentleman-like fop, who gave her a sort of look from top to toe of ineffable insouciance, and used to cry out, when she was telling him some laughable story, "For God's sake, don't make me laugh so. I shall die, I vow and protest. I shall expire from laughing. Now pray, Lady Hester." Something turned the conversation to the Duke d'Arb, who had visited her once. "I told him," said Lady Hester, "he had nothing like a duke about him." "Comment? Est-ce que je suis toi petite?" he asked. "No," I replied, "it is not that. You neither look like one nor act like one." "Oh, I trimmed him," she continued. "He wrote to me after he was gone, and said he had prayed for me at Jerusalem. I wrote him back a letter, so impudent, doctor, and joked him about a belle marquise who, by a shrewd guess, I fancied was his chère amie. I bade him pray for her, and not for me, and sent him, what do you call it when there are 4 lines in rhyme? A quatrain, which I will try to recollect." She mused a little, and then repeated 4 lines, something to this effect: "Ne versa pas de larmes, ma chérie et belle marquise. Tu seras l'héroïne de toutes mes entreprises. J'ai pris toi deux pour toi, et c'est ton héros mère. À toi, je laisse mon ami, à toi je donne mon cœur." Lady Hester added, "He was more like a militia officer than a French duke, and very stingy." "Did Lord St. Asaph publish anything?" she asked. I told her not that I knew of. "He was very active," she added, "and went about seeking for antiquities everywhere. Whenever he heard of anything, off he set and visited it. When he saw my garden, he expressed great admiration of it, and assured me that it was not only well kept for this country, but better kept than many a gentleman's grounds in England." End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Chapter 8, Part 2 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 1, edited by Charles Lewis Meryon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Part 2. Saturday, July 15th. I spent this day and the next at Mar Elias with my family, and returned to June on Monday, July 17th. It has already been remarked that there were 34 people in Lady Hester Stanhope's establishment at the time I am now speaking of, and yet she would complain that she could not get the slightest attendance. This, of course, was mere temper. Her 5 maids were constantly in motion night and day, but she had become querulous to a degree scarcely imaginable, and was, beyond all example, exigeante in her demands on the services of everybody about her. But if such excessive requisition was ever pardonable in anybody, it was in Lady Hester Stanhope, for her vast talents seemed to lay claim to submission from all inferior beings, and even to exact it as a matter of justice. It was always customary with her, as it generally is with people who overwork their servants, to appeal first to one and then to another, whether anybody could give less trouble than she did. "What have my maids got to do?" she would say. "They think themselves mightily put upon. If I only require as much from them as some shopkeeper's wife insists upon from her housemaid. A set of lazy beasts that sleep and stuff all day, and then pretend they are mightily hard worked. Dr. Logmagi says that nothing but the courbash will keep them in order, and depend on it, it is so. If I did not tell them I would have them punished, I should not get the bell answered." It is true she was generous to them in giving them clothes, high wages, presents of money, New Year gifts, etc. But whilst she bestowed with one hand, she tyrannized with the other. These mixed extremities of kindness and severity produced a strange effect upon her servants. I never knew one of them who, after a time, did not wish to leave her service, or, having left it, did not wish to return. The desire to leave her was stimulated by her restless activity, which left nobody quiet day or night, and her determined hostility to indolence, lies, and all other vices common to menials in Syria, while the anxiety to get back again might be in a great measure traced to the dishonest gains which were so readily made in her service, and by which her domestics so frequently enriched themselves, to place nothing to the account of that spell which she infallibly cast over everybody who came within the sphere of her attraction. It cannot be denied that Lady Hester Stanhope had great reason for her strictness. During her severe illness in 1828, when Miss Williams died and she was confined to her bedroom for 3 months, G. and another rascal induced the girl, Fatum, to steal the keys of the storeroom, and whilst they waited outside of the window, the wooden bars of which they sawed through with the adroitness of a London housebreaker, she handed them out much valuable property. Every one of the trunks was opened and examined. Hinges were wrenched off so as to leave the locks untouched, and the trunks were replaced against the wall, and the bars of the window refitted to lull suspicion. One night, as was afterwards revealed in a confession made by one of the maids, when Mr. Dundas, a traveller, who was on a visit at Darjeeun, was sitting with Lady Hester, Fatum took a key from one of her ladyship's pockets, which had been left in her bedroom, opened a small closet, and out of that closet took a bunch of keys, by means of which she ransacked almost everything Lady Hester possessed. Her beautiful Albanian dress, covered with gold, was stolen. A gold medallion commemorative of her brother's and General Moore's death at Corunna shared the same fate. Stuffs, brocades, and other articles of value were all carried off. But the servant who committed the heaviest robberies was Zeynep, a black slave, who afterwards became a soldier's trull. This woman, whose career throughout was marked by every sort of profligacy, robbed Lady Hester to the amount of many thousands of piastres. Lady Hester related, on a subsequent occasion, the winding up of Zeynep's history in the following words, which I wrote down April the 9th, 1838. When Zeynep stole the gold medal, with General Moore's and my brother's name on it, I procured all the documents relative to the theft from Cyprus, where one of her accomplices had fled, and then sent for Zeynep and Fariz into the salon. I called in Logmagi and Khail Mansour as witnesses, and then, telling the culprits what I knew, said I could hang them if I liked. The impudent slave, Zeynep, listened with perfect indifference, and in going out, stopped up the door, and, in an ironical tone, thanked Logmagi, who she thought had told me all about it. Logmagi, surprised at her insolence, went to push her out, when at that moment Abu Ali, the great black, who had, it appears, found his way into the court in order to support the black girl's cause, and had been waiting outside the salon door, seized Logmagi, and, with his muscular grasp, tried to throttle him. I heard a strange noise and went out, and there I saw Logmagi, with his eyes starting out of his head, held down on the ground by the negro. I caught the fellow's hand, although one of his pistols was directed towards me, and with my other arm gave a back-handed stroke across Zeynep's face, who was helping the black, that knocked her down. She got up, scaled the wall, and ran off to Saida, and I never saw her more. I called the Albanians, and had Abu Ali turned out of doors directly. After Zeynep ran away, she threw herself into the arms of the Nizam, or soldiers, where Lady Hester, to use her emphatic language, left her to rot. A short detail of the annoyances to which Lady Hester Stanhope was exposed may serve to show that she was not angry with these women without reason. The endless trifling acts of ignorance, awkwardness, carelessness, forgetfulness, falsehood, and impudence, which she used to relate to me, were quite sufficient upon the whole, although many of them were individually petty enough to justify the severe control she found it necessary to exercise over them. But then it will be asked, why did a lady of her rank, accustomed to all the refinements of European life, keep such servants in her establishment? Why did she not send for Europeans? That was the question that everybody asked, and that nobody could answer. The real fact probably was this. She preferred these poor creatures, with all their demoralization and filthy habits, to French or English servants, because, by the customs of the East, they were habituated to despotism and bursts of passion, which neither English nor French would be very likely to brook so patiently. Besides, no European servants could have reconciled themselves to the melancholy seclusion of Lady Hester Stanhope's establishment, or to the never-ceasing activity, or what is worse, the long vigils required of them. Here there was no moment of respite from doing or waiting to do. In England, the maid looks at least for some intervals of recreation, and expects, at all events, out of the 24 hours, that she shall be allowed 6 or 8 for rest. But there was neither one nor the other at June, for even while her ladyship was engaged with her nightly conversations in the salon, when little or no waiting was required, still there was no end to the work marked out for her servants, such as filling pipes every quarter of an hour, by which they were kept incessantly employed. Now, as Turkish servants turn in almost universally in their clothes, only drawing a counterpane over themselves when they lie down, they are enabled thus to steal a short sleep at any hour they can get it, and are ready to rise at a moment's call. This is a great advantage, especially to sick people. Indeed, in Lady Hester's case, it almost compensated for all their faults. In the twinkling of an eye, upon an emergency, the whole household, only a moment before buried in profound sleep, would start up on their feet, and their duty once over, would suddenly drop again into a deep slumber. One day I went to Lady Hester's bedroom door, without waiting to ascertain whether she was ready to receive me. It was a rule with her for many years never to see anybody, even in her salon, whether coming from a distance or staying in her house, until she had sent for them, no matter who, prince or peasant. And she carried this species of regality to such a length that on one occasion, among 20 which might be mentioned, an English gentleman and his wife, for both of whom she entertained a high personal esteem, having arrived from Beirut to within a league of her dwelling to pay her a visit, and having politely sent forward a servant with a letter to announce their approach, she returned a laconic answer to say they would not be received. She, moreover, was accustomed to mark, not merely the day, but the precise hour that persons coming to visit her were to present themselves. She would do so with Duke Maximilian, or with Matteo Lunardi. On the morning to which I have referred, Lady Hester was in bed. "What do you want?" said she, in rather an angry tone. I replied that I had brought her a cut-glass cup and stand for her sherbet and lemonade, as hers was so common that it gave me pain to see her use it. "No, doctor," she said. "I am much obliged to you, but you must send it away again. If I had 20 fine things, those beasts of maids would break or steal them all. I had some beautiful cut-glass goblets, and they all disappeared, one after the other. Would you believe it? They broke one first of all, and then Miss Williams gave out another. So they kept the pieces of the broken one, and every fortnight or 3 weeks came to her first with one bit, and then with another, with some plausible story of an accident, and each time got another goblet out of her, until all were gone. I found them out at last. The jades destroy everything, but it is not that which gives me pain. It is to think that I have not one person who will see me well waited on." Happening to observe that perhaps some allowance should be made for their ignorance in that respect, as after all they were but peasant girls and slaves, who could not know what service was, seeing they were unacquainted with European customs, she exclaimed, but my liver is destroyed by the passions I put myself in. And I dare say you, instead of helping me, will only make matters worse. They'll only laugh at you and your sensibility. I can see an idle fellow or a rascal get a beating with the same tranquillity that I smoke my pipe. But nobody is more tender than I am, even when an animal suffers unjustly. I never shall forget how 2 or 3 of the servants turned as pale as death on hearing me on a sudden utter a cry because a lazy villain was driving an ass with foal, heavily laden, down a steep bank. I go then almost into convulsions. But oh, how I detest your sentimental people, who pretend to be full of feeling, who will cry over a worm and yet treat real misfortune with neglect. There are your fine ladies that I have seen in a dining room, and when by accident an earwig has come out of a peach, after having been half killed in opening it, one would exclaim, "Oh, poor thing, you have broken its back. Do spare it. I can't bear to see even an insect suffer." Oh, there, my lord, how you hurt it. Stop, let me open the window and put it out. And then the husband drawls out, "My wife is quite remarkable for her sensibility. I married her purely for that." And then the wife cries, "Oh, now, my lord, you are too good to say that. If I had not had a grain of feeling, I should have learned it from you." And so they go on, praising each other. And perhaps the next morning, when she is getting into her carriage, a poor woman with a child at her breast, and so starved that she has not a drop of milk, begs charity of her. And she draws up the glass and tells the footman another time not to let those disgusting people stand at her door. The conversation, on a subsequent occasion, having fallen on the nasty servants, and I, having assented to the truth of what she said, regretting that her acute feelings made her torment herself about things which were but trifles. "Trifles!" she vociferated. "It is trifles, as you call them, that kill me. Everybody comes to me. There are the very maids, if you were only to see, when they have a hole to mend, how they sew it up all in a sponge. They even ask me how their gowns must be cut out." This was a fact, but they came to her because she would have it so. Many a morning have I seen her cutting out gowns and pantaloons for them, and stitching the parts together with her own hands. Her talents were so versatile that she always seemed to have served her time to the particular work, whatever it might be, in which you chanced to find her engaged. I have in my possession patterns in paper of gowns after the Turkish fashion, cut out by Lady Hester's hand. And if any of the travelers who visited her may have had occasion to admire the dresses of her men or maidservants, they may be assured that even down to the embroidery, the models for every one of them were first designed and cut out by their accomplished mistress. Lady Hester Stanhope had another serious reason to be discontented with her servants. Her inner court, the gynecium or harem, was separated from the outer one by a door always, or which always ought to have been kept locked. The key was entrusted to one of the 2 men-servants who lived in this inner court, but whose rooms were divided from the wing where the maids were by a screen of wainscoting, which neither party was allowed to pass. That was the rule, but the practice was far otherwise, and the men were constantly haunting the maids' rooms and the kitchen with perfect security, because the locked door, at which everybody was obliged to knock to get admission, gave them time to arrange their matters so as to escape detection. Lady Hester herself was generally in bed, and perfectly incapable of checking their irregularities. It was not, therefore, to be wondered at if every now and then the sad consequences were not slow in manifesting themselves. For in Turkey, where men are never allowed to associate with women, where the face of a female, even of the lowest class, cannot be uncovered before the other sex without a stain attaching to her modesty, and sometimes to her character, the idea of placing the two sexes in familiar juxtaposition is so foreign to all their notions that both the one and the other, when such occasions present themselves, fancy all reserve is at an end, and use their opportunities accordingly. Chastity, in our sense of the word, social and moral, is perhaps unknown among Mahometans. The woman who is well guarded, or the maiden who lives strictly under her mother's wing, is kept chaste. But she who is neglected thinks that there is no longer any reason for restraint, or believes, at all events, that she does no great wrong in thinking so. Lady Hester, no doubt, knew all this better than anyone, but there was no remedy. She did not feel sure of the good conduct of one single maid-servant. As long as Miss Williams was alive, the awe they all stood in of her made things go on with propriety. But after her death, all these disorders crept in. One of the very European men-servants whom Lady Hester kept as a check on the people of the country set them a profligate example himself, and then sought a pretext for leaving her service. In another instance, a black slave was found to have formed an illicit connection with a black man. Lady Hester Stanhope obliged the man to marry her, and gave them both their freedom. Her ladyship did not visit these untoward events with severity. Only, as it is a common practice in Turkey to procure abortion, and as there is no notice taken of such things by the public authorities, who often set the example openly in their own harems, all that Lady Hester ever did in these cases was to call the offenders before her, and tell them she would have them hanged if they resorted to any secret means of that kind. And she was a person to be as good as her word. Her views in such matters were lenient and compassionate in reference to the circumstances in which these unfortunate creatures were often placed. But there was nothing she held in such utter detestation as mere animal vices. It was naturally Lady Hester's object to enlist me on her side into her plan of keeping her household regulated according to the rules of the strictest decorum, and I, of course, was most happy to lend my assistance. Previous to my arrival, I had been, both now and on my former visit in 1831, held up as a bugbear to all the servants, and the common exclamation in her mouth was, "Ah, when the doctor comes, he will very soon set you to rights." But I was not at all, either from temperament or reflection, ambitious of filling a post of that sort, and although she turned against me at different times the shafts of ridicule and a never-ceasing battery of abuse, I passively but firmly declined all participation in the severity of her measures. Sunday, July 23rd. I rode over to Mar Elias and returned again to the Dar on Monday night. July 24th. Lady Hester Stanhope took a great deal of pains to make me acquainted with all that was going on both in the house and in the neighborhood. Still, she never touched on the property left or said to be left her, and it was not until August the 3rd that the subject was fairly entered upon. But as what she communicated then will come in more appropriately when the correspondence which took place in reference to it shall be given, we will proceed to other matters. August 4th. The people of Europe, said Lady Hester, are all, or at least the greater part of them, fools, with their ridiculous grins, their affected ways, and their senseless habits. And all the parties I was in during the time I lived with Mr. Pitt, and they were a great many, out of thousands of people, I hardly saw 10 whose conversation interested me. I smiled when they spoke to me and passed on, but they left no agreeable impressions on my mind. Look at Monsieur Blank, getting off his horse half a dozen times to kiss his dog, and take him out of his bandbox to feed him on the road from Beirut here. The very muleteers and servants thought him a fool. And then that way of thrusting his hands in his breeches pockets, sticking out his legs as far as he could, what is that like? Monsieur Blank is no poet, in my estimation, although he may be an elegant versifier. He has no sublime ideas. Compare his ideas with Shakespeare's. That was indeed a real poet. Oh, doctor, what inspirations there are in that man! Even his imaginary beings, his Ariels, his fairies, his Calibans, we see at once are such as they would be if they had really existed. You don't believe in such things, but I do, and so did Shakespeare. He, I am sure, had great knowledge of Eastern literature, somehow or another. Monsieur Blank, with his straight body and straight fingers, pointed his toes in my face, and then turned to his dog and kissed him and held long conversations with him. They say he has 17,000 pounds a year, and castles and villages. He thought to make a great effect when he was here, but he was grievously mistaken. I gave him a letter to Abu Ghosh, who received him very well. But when he talked about himself and made out that he was a great man, Abu Ghosh said it was for my sake and not his own that he showed him as much honor as he could. In speaking of M. Lascaris, of whom Monsieur L. has written a great deal, Lady Hester said M. Lascaris had the heart of a Roman with the intrigue of a Greek. End of Chapter 8, Part 2. Chapter 9, Part 1 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 1, edited by Charles Lewis Meryon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Part 1. Some allusion having been made to Queen Caroline, Lady Hester asked me what they said in England about her trial. "Do," said she, "tell me something about it. Did you see her? I suppose it was like Warren Hastings' trial." She continued, "I prevented the explosion the first time, and I will tell you how. One day the Duke of Cumberland called on me, and in his accustomed manner began, 'Well, Lady Hester, it will be all out tomorrow, We have printed it all, and tomorrow it will all be out." I knew what he meant, and I said to him, "Have you got the Chancellor's leave? I, for my part, don't like the business at all." "Why don't you like it?" asked the Duke. "Because," answered I have too much respect for royalty to desire to see it made a subject for Grub Street songs." I did not say this so much on the P. of W.'s account as for the sake of the P.S. I dreaded the other disclosures to which a business like this might lead. The Duke turned away, as if in thought, and I saw that the same idea struck him, for after a pause he resumed his position and answered, "You are quite right, Lady Hester. By God, you are quite right. But what am I to do? We have gone too far. What am I to do?" "Why, I think," rejoined I, "the best thing you can do is to go and ask the Chancellor." So off he packed, and I fancy Mr. Percival and the Chancellor and he talked it over and decided on quashing the business. Why, Doctor, the papers were all printed, and it cost Mr. Percival £10,000 out of the Secret Service money to recover one copy which had been taken off his table. Going out in a hurry, and forgetting to lock it up, he had left the book open in his room. It was not a thing to escape. Somebody stole it, and I know to a certainty that it cost him £10,000 to get it back again. As for the P's of W., I did not care about her. She was a nasty, vulgar, impudent woman that was not worth telling a lie about. I could never feel for her. If she had been a different kind of person, one might have made up one's mind to swear that it was one's self that was walking in one's night-clothes from one bedroom to another, and not Her Royal Highness. I always used to tell the ladies in waiting, if they ever saw me closeted with her, to contrive some excuse or other to come in and break up the conversation. I was determined she should never make a confidant of me. Sometimes she would begin with, "You know, Lady Hester, that Sir Richard," and then I was sure to begin to cough or to interrupt her with, "Oh, I'm going out to walk," or whatever happened to come into my head, so as to put a stop to her revelations. I warned the D. of B. that if the commission examined me, I would make his old uncle blush finely. If they ask me an impudent question, I will always answer, "I don't understand," and so go on with, "I don't understand, until I make them, by that, put their questions in such clear terms that their primosity will be finally puzzled. And then I'll put the examination into the newspapers." This frightened them all so that they did not know what to do. But it was I that was really frightened, terribly, Doctor, and I pretended to be so bold about it, only to drive them from their purpose, and I succeeded too. Oh, what an impudent woman was that P. of W. She was a downright blank. She had a Chinese figure in one of her rooms at Blackheath that was wound up like a clock, and used to perform the most extraordinary movements. How the sea captains used to colour up when she danced about, exposing herself like an opera girl. And then she gartered below the knee. She was so low, so vulgar. I quarrelled with her at Plymouth, for I was the only person that ever told her the truth, and Lady Carnarvon assured me afterwards that they had never seen her moved so much as after a conversation I had with her. I plainly told her it was a hanging matter, and that she should mind what she was about. The prince, I intimated to her, might do her a great deal of mischief when he became king. "Oh, he will never be king," she would reply, for a German fortune-teller had told her she would never be queen, and as she believed the fortune-teller, she thought she was safe. There was a handsome footman who might have been brought into the scrape if the trial had related to anybody but the Italian courier. Then Lady Hester asked me what had become of young Austen. "I did not believe," added she, "that the child was anybody else's but the reputed mother's at Greenwich. And as for the P's of W's adopting it and making such a fuss about it, it was only pure spite to vex the prince. He was a nasty boy. Oh, how Mr. Pitt used to frown when he was brought in after dinner and held by a footman over the table to take up anything out of the dessert that he liked. And when the P's used to say to Mr. Pitt, 'Don't you think he is a nice boy?' he would reply, 'I don't understand anything about children. Your R.H. had better ask his nurse, for she knows these things better than I do.' He was indeed a nasty, mischievous boy. I once saw him at Lord Mount Edgecombe's, turning over the leaves of a valuable book of plates backward and forward with his nasty fingers that he had just before smeared in the ink. I told the P's it was a shame to let him dirt and tear books of such value, and she gave him another, a common one, but he cried and whimpered and said he would have the first. I declared he shouldn't, and said if he dared touch it, he should see what I would do. My resolute manner frightened him. Once he cried for a spider on the ceiling, and though they gave him all sorts of playthings to divert his attention, he would have nothing but the spider. Then there was such a calling of footmen and long sticks, and such a to-do. He was a little, nasty, vulgar brat. It was unpardonable in the P's to lavish her love upon such a little urchin of a boy, a little beggar, really no better. To see him brought in every day after dinner, bawling and kicking down the wine, and hung up by his breeches over the table for people to laugh at, and so ugly. Then she had 5 or 6 more, not one of whom was pretty, except a little midshipman, son of a beautiful woman in the Isle of Wight. It was supposed that she kept these little urchins to carry her love letters. She certainly used to employ them in that way, sometimes as a sort of make-believe. I know that when she used to invite a sea captain to dinner, instead of sending a scarlet footman in a barge, as she ought to have done, she would tell one of these boys to go on board and give her billet to Captain Such-a-one, and on no account to let it fall into anyone else's hands, making people imagine there was a mystery when there really was none. Indeed, when one thinks of Lady Blank, of Lord Blank, and such characters, the P's is not so much to blame after all. There was no lack of bad example. In all London you could not find a more abandoned character than Lord Blank. He had exhausted every species of vice known in the Palais Royal, and was so notorious in that way that some gentlemen refused to meet him at dinner unless they were sure of having grave and weighty people present who could keep him in order. Yet he is a clever, sharp man. No person has carried on more intrigues in the very first classes, and then to finish by marrying a woman who really did not know who her father and mother were. Strange enough, you will say. She left him for a Frenchman and lives at Paris. But he is on very good terms with her. He says she is in the right if she likes a Frenchman better. She came over to England sometimes by means of a passport during the war to see him and arrange matters about their children. The P had always been used to women of such perfect cleanliness and sweetness that it is no wonder he was disgusted with the P's of W, who was a sloven and did not know how to put on her own clothes. Those kind of people should let themselves be dressed as you dress a doll. She did sometimes, but then she was sure to spoil it all again by putting on her stockings with the seam before, or one of them wrong side outwards, and then her manner of fastening them, it was shocking. Mrs. Fitzherbert had a beautiful skin. At 60, it was like a child's of 6 years old, for I knew her well, having passed at one time 6 weeks in the same house with her. So had Lady Blank and her daughters. There are some people who are sweet by nature, and who, even if they are not washed for a fortnight, are free from odor, whilst there are others who 2 hours after they have been to a bath generate a fusty atmosphere about them. Mrs. Fitzherbert likewise had a great deal of tact in concealing the prince's faults. She would say, "Don't send your letter to such a person. He is careless and will lose it." Or, when he was talking foolish things, she would tell him, "You are drunk tonight. Do hold your tongue." Poor Mrs. Robinson was a woman of a different kind, naturally good and innocent, and perhaps there was personal love towards him in her composition. But then she had no cleverness. I don't mean in politics, but none in common matters. She possessed no guiding influence over him, so that he scribbled and wrote to her things that, if they had been brought to light, would have stamped him with infamy. When she died, she charged her daughter never to part with a certain casket, but they got it out of her for £10,000. I believe it was Lord M. who got possession of it. But a peer told me that there were most abominable things in those letters, not of common debauchery, but of every nature. I, for my part, believe he was really married to Mrs. Robinson, and yet he left her to starve, and she would have starved if it had not been for Sir Henry Halford. August 6th. This being Sunday, I spent it as usual with my family. August 7th. Lady Hester Stanhope spoke of Mr. Canning. She said, "The first time he was introduced to Mr. Pitt, a great deal of prosing had been made beforehand of his talents, and when he was gone, Mr. P. asked me what I thought of him. I said I did not like him, for, doctor, his forehead was bad, his eyebrows were bad, he was ill made about the hips, but his teeth were evenly set, although he rarely showed them. I did not like his conversation. Mr. C. heard of this, and some time after, when upon a more familiar footing with me, said, "So, Lady Hester, you don't like me?" "No," said I. "They told me you were handsome, and I don't think so." Upon this point I ventured to observe that much admiration was generally expressed of Mr. C.'s features, more especially of the forehead. The reader is probably familiar with Sir Thomas Lawrence's portrait of him. "Good God!" she exclaimed, "what fools people are! A man in London does not even know what his next-door neighbor is, but he sees him go in and out, and he says he has a fine open countenance and a fine forehead. Some people thought Mr. C. had a fine forehead because it was bald. There was not one feature or one limb in C. but what was vulgar, except his teeth, and I am not sure those were not false. And why I think so is that once, in the House of Commons, he spit blood in his pocket-handkerchief, and said he had a dreadful toothache. People don't spit blood with toothaches. I recollect once, when we were sitting at breakfast, C. began reading some advertisements about Macassar oil and those sorts of things, and pretended not to know what they meant. And afterwards my maid told me that she entered his dressing-room when he was at Putney, and was shown by his valet one of the finest dressing-cases she had ever seen, filled with all sorts of perfumes, which his man drew out one by one before her. Lady Hester went on, for of Mr. C. she could never speak calmly, and his name once introduced was sure to lead to an angry diatribe. "Oh, Lord, when I think of his duplicity! For it was not on matters of this sort only, but in everything that he was deceitful. I only regret that he ever took me in as he did. But he was so artful as to make me believe at last in his protestations of admiration for Mr. Pitt. And as Mr. Pitt was surrounded by such fools as C.TL.H. and H.K.B.Y., I thought he might be useful to him in lightening his labours, for he was clever and wrote well, whilst Mr. Pitt could never trust Lord C. to draw up an official paper without having to cross out and correct half of it. But the first time I saw him, I thought him insincere, and told Mr. Pitt so, and I did not scruple to add how much I disliked him. "Oh," Mr. Pitt replied, "he is very amusing, and when you have seen more of him, you will think so too." "Well, we shall see," said I. "You must like him," rejoined Mr. Pitt. "He is so brilliant." I answered, "Well, if I must, I must." But I never did. It is true I took a great deal of pains to get him into favour again when he was out of favour with Mr. Pitt, but it was because I really believed him to be Mr. Pitt's friend, and thought he would be another strong horse in the stable. It was so with Sir H.P. The first time I saw his face, I thought I had never seen so bad a countenance. It was the spirit of evil rising up before me, and I was not mistaken in his case any more than in the other. Oh, when I think of C.'s deceit, how he used to come to me and cry out, Ah, Lady Hester, what have I not done to please you? I have drunk a glass of wine with that fool H. A glass of wine, such a glass of wine, 'twas like physic to me. Why, I have seen him at Mr. Pitt's table pretend not to hear when Lord H. spoke to him. Mr. Pitt used to say, "What does he mean by all this? If he does not like him, why does he come to my table when he is to be there?" But I know how I could reconcile them. If I would but give C a place in the cabinet, he would make it up directly. But he shan't have it. "No," said he, "C shall never have a place in the cabinet whilst I have a voice." His duplicity was perfect. He used to say to me, "My dear Lady Hester, how could I ever drink a glass of wine with a man whom I have so ridiculed, whom I have made verses on?" And after that I have seen him professing the warmest friendship for this same man, the object of so much ridicule and contempt. I have still by me one of his letters, one of the only two I ever kept, that he wrote me of 4 sheets before Mr. Pitt's death, and which I always kept because I feared how it would be, in which he goes on for 10 pages, I really think, with, "My dearest Lady Hester, what is the meaning of all this? I know no more of all that is passing than the child unborn. Do write to me, do tell me. They have made Lord Mulgrave minister, etc." And all this time he was ... One day Miss Williams saw the paragraph in the newspaper where Mr. C. was gazetted as Prime Minister, and she immediately brought it and showed it to me. I said to her, "Was ever anything so monstrous? Why, when he paces those rooms in Downing Street, which have witnessed his lies and his deceit, the very stones will rise up to crush him. I remember when Mr. Pitt was lying ill at Bath, one day there were no letters. Charles came in, and Mr. Pitt said, 'Are there no letters?' 'None,' replied Charles. 'Nothing but that C is going on very well.' 'Very well,' was Mr. Pitt's reply. 'To be sure he will go on very well, as long as he has got your sister to guide him. But if she ever quits him, that ambitious blank of his, badly ambitious, will soon spoil all the good Hester has done for him. How could he live in Downing Street and enter those rooms where I have had him before me, crying like a child? Yes, doctor, I used to make him cry and blubber like a schoolboy, and making 1,000 protestations which he never kept. How could he dare to talk of Mr. Pitt's principles? He sent me once a fine copy of verses. They were very well written, in which he compared Mr. Pitt to a bound eagle. Oh, how Lord Temple tried to steal them! He snatched them away from me one evening, when he, James, and I were together, and jumping into a chair, held them out of my reach. I was so angry that I pulled a fine repeater out of his fob and dashed it the ground. He then ran into the street without his hat, and James after him, and the watchman took him for a thief and joined in the pursuit. But I got them back." Lady Hester here made a pause, and then added, "I know C would, if he could, he and all his creatures, have annihilated me." Another reason why Mr. Pitt disliked C was that he was not to be trusted. Mr. Pitt used to say, "I don't understand what it is that people mean when they go and repeat every word they hear in society to their intimate friend there as myself." For he had seen in the oracle whole conversations. Not that C put them in himself, but that he told them to some friend, and then, a week or a fortnight after, one saw, "We are credibly informed," "We have reason to believe," with every syllable Mr. Pitt had talked about put down as a piece of exclusive political information. August 10th. I went to Mar Elias and remained a couple of days. In the morning of the 10th, Lady Hester Stanhope, in the course of conversation, said, "I must send you to the chief of the serpents." You don't know what that means. I'll tell you. There is a cavern in a distant part of this country, inhabited by a great serpent, who has hundreds of others at his command. He has got the head of a man, the body of a serpent, and wings. He has been seen by many persons, and it is all perfectly true. Perhaps you don't believe in such things?" This was an embarrassing question, but I tried to evade the difficulty by observing that nothing was impossible to the Almighty. "Well," rejoined Lady Hester, "you shall go and take a drawing of the cave." She asked me what had become of Tom Moore. I said he had latterly made a profession of faith, and had written a book to prove himself a good Catholic. "I dare say it was very well written," said she. "I always liked that man." "It might be well written," I replied, "but his other works have been more read." "What are they?" she asked. I enumerated them, and among the rest his Life of Sheridan, of Byron, and of Lord E.F. "Ah, those I should like to read," observed Lady Hester. "We must get them." Sunday, August 13th. I remained with Lady Hester, reading and talking until midnight. She was greatly pleased with the Penny Magazine, a volume or two of which I had with me, and some conversation having arisen respecting English poetry, I selected Lord Byron's stanzas on the dying gladiator, Wolfe's lines on the death of General Moore, Mr. Moore's on his own birthday, and Pringle's "Alone in the desert I love to ride." Of Byron's, she said, "I don't see much in them." Wolfe she extolled greatly, and thought his poetry finer than Lord Byron's. Of Mr. Moore she said again, "I always liked that little man," and she laughed where he expresses a wish to live his life over again, exclaiming in another sense, "Ah, I dare say he does." Her remark on Pringle was, "That's a good man, I'll venture to say. There are some good thoughts there." I then read the death of Mary Queen of Scots, of Lady Jane Grey, on the effects of tight lacing, and on boarding-school mismanagement. "Oh," observed she, "if I had time, I would write a book on Swiss governesses. They are the most artful, nasty creatures you can't imagine." End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Chapter 9, Part 2 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 1, edited by Charles Lewis Meryon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Part 2. It may be recollected by some of my readers that in her correspondence with Lord Palmerston, Lady Hester Stanhope made use of this expression: "Whoever had been the bearer of a disagreeable message to me would have found me to be a cousin of Lord Camelford's." She admired Lord C.'s character, and in some things imitated him. His name happened to be mentioned, and she spoke of him in the following words: "Lord Camelford was not such a man as you would have supposed. He was tall and bony, rather pale, with his head hanging generally a little on one side so. What a fright people were in whenever he came! I recollect his taking me one evening to a party, and it was quite a scene to notice how the men shuffled away and the women stared at him. At last there was a countess, then a little passée, with a 10-years' reputation for fashionable intrigues, who came and sat down by him on the sofa and began talking to him. She was a woman who had seen a great deal of the world, and knew, as well as anybody, the true characteristics of men of high breeding and fashion. He went away before supper, and then how she broke out about him! She could talk of nothing else but Lord Camelford. Such delightful manners, such fascinating conversation! He was quite charming, irresistible, so well bred, such a ton about him. And so she ran on, in a perfect ecstasy of admiration. People were very much mistaken about him. His generosity and the good he did in secret passes all belief. He used to give £5,000 a year to his lawyer to distribute among distressed persons. "The only condition I enjoin," he used to say, "is not to let them know who it comes from." He would sometimes dress himself in a jacket and trousers like a sailor, and go to some tavern or alehouse. And if he fell in with a poor-looking person, who had an air of trouble or poverty, he would contrive to enter into conversation with him, and find out all about him. "Come," he would say, "tell me your story, and I will tell you mine." He was endowed with great penetration, and if he saw that the man's story was true, he would slip £50 or £100 into his hand with this admonitory warning: "Recollect, you are not to speak of this. If you do, you will have to answer for it in a way you don't like." Mr. Pitt liked him personally as much as I did, but considerations of propriety arising out of his position obliged him to keep him at a distance. How frightened Lady Chatham was for fear he should marry me! Lord Chatham thought to have the Beaucourt estate, or some such name, but he was prettily taken in, for Lord Camelford paid £50,000 to cut off the entail, and left it to his sister. Mr. Pitt took little or no notice of him, out of absolute fear of the scrapes he was constantly getting into. He was greatly perplexed about him when he shot the lieutenant, but Lord Camelford did it from a quick perception of what was right to be done, which was a sort of instinct with him. He saw that the ship's crew was ready to mutiny, and he stopped it at once by his resolute conduct. Everybody at home was open-mouthed against him, until the news came of Captain Pigot of the Hermione being thrown overboard. And then all the lords and ladies began to tremble for their sons and nephews. And nothing was too good for Lord Camelford, and the next mutiny which took place in our ships showed how well he had foreseen what would happen. I recollect once he was driving me out in his curricle, when, at a turnpike gate, I saw him pay the man himself, and take some halfpence in exchange. He turned them over 2 or 3 times in his hand without his glove. Well, thought I, if you like to handle dirty copper, it is a strange taste. "Take the reins a moment," said he, giving them to me, and out he jumped. And before I could form the least suspicion of what he was going to do, he rushed upon the turnpike man and seized him by the throat. Of course there was a mob collected in a moment, and the high-spirited horses grew so restive that I expected nothing less than that they would start off with me. In the midst of it all, a coach and 4 came to the gate. "Ask what's the matter," said a simpering sort of gentleman, putting his head with an air out of the coach window to the footman behind. "It's my Lord Camelford," replied the footman. "You may drive on," was the instant ejaculation of the master, frightened out of his senses at the bare apprehension lest his lordship should turn to him. The row was soon over, and Lord C. resumed his seat. "I dare say you thought," he said very quietly, "that I was going to put myself in a passion. But the fact is, these rascals have barrels of bad halfpence, and they pass them in change to the people who go through the gate. Some poor carter, perhaps, has nothing but this change to pay for his supper, and when he gets to his journey's end, finds he can't get his bread and cheese. The law, 'tis true, will find them, but how is a poor devil to go to law? Where can he find time? To you and me it would not signify, but to the poor it does. And I merely wanted to teach those blackguards a lesson, by way of showing them that they cannot always play such tricks with impunity. Doctor, you should have seen, when we came back again, how humble and cringing the turnpike man was. Lord C. was a true pit, and like me, his blood fired at a fraud or a bad action. A messenger had arrived in the course of the day from Monsieur Guy, French consul at Beirut, to announce the landing of an Italian lady we expected from Leghorn, whom I had engaged to join us in Syria. Mustafa, a Turkish servant, was immediately dispatched to see to her wants, and the secretary, who spoke Italian, sailed in a shaktour from Saida to convey her by water, the heat rendering the land journey very oppressive. August 12th. I rode over to Mar Elias to see my family and make arrangements for the reception of the newcomer. And as Lady Hester Stanhope had some business at Beirut, which required my presence, respecting an importunate creditor, it was decided that I should go thither, under the plea of thanking Monsieur and Madame Guy for the hospitality they had shown to the Italian lady. Monday, August 14th, 1837. I departed an hour before sunrise, and reached Beirut in the evening, meeting on the road the half-broiled secretary who, in consequence of a calm, had not reached his destination until 12 hours after Signora L. had sailed, the little wind there was being fair for her and foul for him. Our ultimate intention in forming an engagement with Signora L., whom we had known for some years struggling in adversity, was to place her with Lady Hester Stanhope as housekeeper, a situation for which she was extremely well qualified. August 18th. I remained in Beirut the 16th and 17th, and returned to Darjeeling on the 18th. I had hardly dismounted from my horse when Lady Hester put a letter into my hands, by which I was summoned in the greatest haste to Mar Elias, to attend on Signora L., who, as soon as she had reached that place, had been taken ill with a brain fever, arising from the fatigue of the voyage, exposure to the burning sun, and the circumstances incidental to Eastern travelling, which are so strange and foreign to European habits. A messenger had been dispatched on the first intimation that Lady Hester Stanhope had received of Signora L.'s indisposition to one Mustapha, a barber at Saida, to betake himself to Mar Elias and bleed her, and when I arrived some hours afterwards, Lady Hester strongly recommended me to leave her case in Mustapha's hands, as he was a surgeon as well as a barber, and highly esteemed in Saida for his skill. She hinted also that European physicians who applied the same course of treatment in the East which they were accustomed to prescribe in the North must inevitably do more harm than good. I acquiesced in these observations with the best grace I could. Saturday, August 19th. On reaching Mar Elias, I was informed that on the morning of the 14th, when Signora L. arrived, she showed a marked oddity in her actions, to which at first little attention was paid, but that, in the succeeding night, she walked about in an unseemly manner, almost undressed, first in her own room, and then in the quadrangle, to the great scandal and consternation of the inmates. The following morning she cut off her hair close to the roots with her own hand, and her conduct at last excited so much alarm that it was considered necessary to send for me without loss of time. The next day, which was the 16th, left no doubt of her brain being disordered, as she sung and danced and laughed without intermission, saying and doing the most extravagant things. She had already been bled when I saw her, and her bed had been removed into the chapel, the most airy part of the dwelling. The bleeding, although continued until she fainted, had produced no effect, and in the night she tore off the bandages, with the loss of a still greater quantity of blood. A blister was put on her head, and medicine was administered. But certain things which I observed on the 20th and 21st, such as putting ice, not only on her head, but on her abdomen, administering pepper in powder, and a written paper macerated in water as a charm to drink, together with sundry superstitious and empirical remedies, induced me to ride over to Lady Hester, and to tell her I could have nothing to do with the treatment unless Mustapha was instantly sent about his business. But Lady Hester Stanhope had lived so long in the East that charms, popular remedies, and quackery were more in unison with her notions than rational and scholastic rules of nosology. She therefore replied that, as Signora L. had come to be in her service, She presumed she might direct what she chose to have done, and that she should confide her wholly to Haji Mustafa's care. I told her I disclaimed all responsibility as to the consequences. Lady Hester then dispatched 2 men servants to fetch from June or Saida whatever Mustafa might require, retaining him at the same time to remain in constant attendance on the poor invalid, with strict injunctions to spare no trouble nor money which the case might require. August 23rd. I went back to Mar Elias to make these arrangements known, and to tell the governess, Miss Longchamp, and the maids to let Signora L. want for nothing. Miss L. was, night and day, at her bedside, and the maids assisted in turn. Everything was done that could be thought of to make her situation comfortable. But her case was now become one of maniacal delirium. She raved without intermission, she knew nobody, she closed her teeth and refused the admission of food. If her arms were free for a moment, she tore her bandages, her garments, and the bedclothes, sometimes laughing and sometimes singing, but with much taste and execution, an Italian song, Nel cor pui non mi sento, or else Malbrook. When she could, she rose from her bed and danced on the floor, being apparently pleased to get on the cold stones. Sometimes she appeared to be dangling a child in her arms. Her arms moved perpetually. Now and then her actions indicated satyriasis. Generally, she showed by her manner that the light was disagreeable to her, but nothing could make her pay attention to what was said to her. There was a copious and frothy expectoration, but the grinding of her teeth and straining of her eyes almost out of their sockets was fearful. And in such moments of excitement, she repeatedly execrated certain frati, or friars by name. It was necessary to have the room completely stripped of everything, for such was her violence that one night, being left but a moment to herself, she loosened her arms, leapt out of bed, and tore a leghorn hat, a parasol, and half a dozen frills, band, box, and all to fritters. August 24th. It was found necessary to make a strait waistcoat for her. The governess, who saw everything that was administered, told me that Haji Mohammed received secret instructions from Lady Hester Stanhope with sundry packets. August 29th, Tuesday. I rode over to Darjeeling and again protested against these proceedings. But finding my views did not accord with Lady Hester's, and that she could not see me again the next day, which was Wednesday, I returned to Mar Elias. September 1st. A priest was sent for, and administered extreme unction to Signora L., who was now evidently sinking. For the first time, and only for a moment, she recovered her reason so far as to ask for water, aqua, aqua, and to utter, oime, oime, I am dying. But immediately afterwards her intellects became disordered again. I was informed by the governess that about noon she appeared in the last gasp, on seeing which Haji Mustafa jerked her pillow from under her head, threw it to a distance, and pulled her legs straight, which pulling he repeated each time she drew them up. This I learned was in accordance with the usages of the Mahometans. September 2nd. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Signora L. died, and at 5 the same afternoon was buried in the Catholic burying ground at Sida, Lady Hester Stanhope's secretary and myself following as chief mourners, with the French vice-consul and some French merchants from Sida, who paid the last tribute to her memory. Before the body was removed, a monk of the Order of Terra Santa and 8 Maronite priests, collected from the town and villages adjoining, performed a funeral service over her corpse in the chapel where it lay. Thus ended this sad tragedy, with every mark of respect that grief at her loss on our part and sympathy from the European residents at Sida could testify. The tenor of Lady Hester Stanhope's mind and the peculiarity of her actions and habits may be gathered from a note or two that were sent to me from Darjeeling to Mar Elias during this poor lady's illness. Lady Hester Stanhope to Dr. Blank, June, August 20th. I send you a pair of sheets, a coverlet, and 2 cotton-stuffed pillows for Madame L. and a bed. Also some arrowroot, some lemons, old newspapers, should they be wanted, basins, etc., a bottle of Benef sage, syrup of violets, and one of Word, syrup of roses, which to some people is of use medicinally. I hope you will find Madame L. not so ill as she was made out to be. There must not be the least noise. Nothing is so bad for persons in her state. I shall expect to see you tomorrow morning, and then you can return again on Monday. I expect to see you if Madame L. gets better. My compliments to Mrs. Blank and Mademoiselle Longchamp. I feel much for them. I am afraid that the chapel is damp, and that a stone roof is not good for Madame L.'s head. But that depends upon her star. Many people can bear to sleep under a stone roof, but I, for one, would rather sleep out of doors in the rain. However, let Haji Mustafa decide. He knows best. Yours sincerely, H.L.S. I had forgotten a tarbouche and an archaea in case Madame L. should have her head shaved. Also some common towels of the country. The same to the same. June, September 2nd, 2 in the morning. I think you should consult with Mr. Conti about the funeral, as Madame L. is a French subject. I can give no other advice, only I must add that my love for the French will make me little consider expense, in order that all may be respectable. H.L.S. Haji Mustafa may go away when he pleases. The consular seals were put on Madame L.'s effects, an inventory having been taken of them in the presence of General Lostaneau and Miss Longchamp. They were then carried to Sida, and afterwards to Beirut, to await the directions of her relatives as to their disposal. Other formalities were fulfilled, and on. September 7th. I betook myself again to June. It was about this time, but I forgot to note when, that General Cass, who was on a tour in the Mediterranean, paid a visit to Lady Hester, bringing with him his family. General Cass, it will be recollected, was, and is now, 1839, ambassador from the United States to the court of France. His visit, I believe, had not been previously announced. At all events, I knew nothing of it, and was absent at Abra when it took place, so that I had not the honor of seeing him or his amiable daughters. End of Chapter 9, Part 2. Chapter 10, Part 1 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 1, edited by Charles Lewis Meryon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 1. Again, the necessity occurs of introducing my personal affairs in order to keep up the thread of our story. Madame L's melancholy disorder and its fatal termination had left such awful impressions on the females of my family that they expressed an earnest wish to remove from a scene where every object excited some melancholy reflection. It was in vain, they were told. There was no other house in the country in which they could live so comfortably. Their answer was that day and night they were haunted with the cries and frantic laugh of poor Madame L., and that they would prefer even the most wretched peasant's cottage to remaining where they were. They represented also the forlorn state in which they were left during my absence at Lady Hester Stanhope's for a week and a fortnight together, having nobody near them for a protector but General Lustenau, a man now 82 years of age, impaired in intellect and sinking into imbecility. But Lady Hester had no consideration for all these womanish weaknesses. Her former animosity against Mrs. Blank had not abated one jot. She held to our agreement that my family was to be considered as strangers with whom she had nothing to do. For, as I had brought them contrary to her wishes, I must look to them myself, without expecting any sympathy from her. I observed to her how much more convenient it would be for all parties if she would only lend me one of the cottages she had empty in the village of June, which I could fit up for our temporary dwelling, and which, from its proximity, would save me so many journeys to and fro. But, as Cabour had foretold, there was no reconciling these conflicting interests. At last she proposed an arrangement, to which I acceded much against my will, as I knew it would put her to great inconvenience. No news having yet arrived from England respecting the properties supposed to have been bequeathed to her, she suggested that I should set off with my family to Beirut or Cyprus, and live there until she had certain advice that money was forthcoming sufficient to pay her debts, when I could easily return and execute those services for her which she required of me. This plan was settled, as it appeared, finally. In the meantime, Lady Hester had taken advantage of a leisure day to enter into the full particulars of her debts. I will therefore give some account of their origin, and show how it was that she who, during her residence in England after Mr. Pitt's death, and during the many years I was with her in Turkey, was one of the most punctual and over-generous payers I ever knew, could have fallen into the opposite extreme, and have thus exposed herself to the degradation of having duns at her gate, and her name in the mouths of the moneyed men at Beirut as a defaulter. What I could recollect sufficiently well to write down the same night in Lady Hester's own words, was as follows. "After the death of Melem Haim," said she, "the celebrated Jewish saraf or banker to Abdullah Pasha of Acre, by whom he was strangled, all the Jews of the Pashalic were immersed. Some of these came to me and entreated me, for the love of God, to lend them money to satisfy the Pasha's extortions, and save them from being bastinaded, and perhaps worse. I was at that time low in purse myself, and could only give them 3,000 piastres, which was all I had. I subsequently lent them more, for which they gave me in payment damaged pieces of cloth, 6-penny pocket-handkerchiefs, and other goods, which of course I could not dispose of except at a ruinous loss. I knew I was cheated by them, but I was too proud to complain. Not long after this, Abdallah Pasha himself, having been declared Firmanli, or outlawed, by the Porte, 6 Pashas, with their combined forces, were sent to besiege him in Acre. Provisions and animals became so scarce that I was obliged to send people to buy camels in the desert, and then dispatch them under the care of a Jew, of whom I had scarcely any knowledge, to buy corn for myself and the house. When at last, and partly by my means, Abdallah Pasha had obtained his pardon from the Porte, but upon condition of paying an immense fine, he pretended to sell his pipes, shawls, carpets, and jewels to raise the money. For he was, or affected to be, so low in his treasury that the dalals, or auctioneers, were to be seen hawking even his wearing apparel in the bazaar. Among other ways of meeting the demands of the Sultan, he applied to me to lend him as much money as I could possibly raise, and I, not doubting that he would repay me honorably, after drawing for what money I had at my disposal in England, applied to a usurious Christian of Beirut, who, at an exorbitant rate of interest, furnished me with what I required. No sooner was the rate known which I was to pay for what I had borrowed than Turks, Christians, and Jews presented themselves with offers of loans to whatever extent I wished, all professing that their purses were at my disposal, that it was beneath a lady of my rank to discuss matters so paltry as money concerns, and that all they required was merely my signature to a scrap of paper, just acknowledging the debt. In this way I signed small bits of paper, it is true, but well and legally worded in Arabic, or Armenian, or Hebrew, which I could not read, and by which I bound myself to pay enormous interest, varying from 25 to 50%. This was the real beginning of my debts and difficulties. For Abdallah Pasha gave me bills at 31 days' sight on Constantinople, payment of which was deferred under one pretence or another for a year, whilst I, in the interim, was in such want of money that I was reduced to a single adli. The worst of all was that I don't think the Pasha wanted it, but only pretended poverty to deceive the Porte. However, in consequence of his failing to repay me at the time agreed on, which repayment would have placed me immediately in a state of solvency, I found myself reduced absolutely to destitution. On one occasion, as I said, I was left without a farthing, and M. Lostenau went off to M. Bodine, who was at Damascus, and told him that, as he owed his advancement in life in part to me, he was bound to assist me in my extremity. M. Bodine at first hesitated. M. Lostenau insisted, and B. lent me 4,000 Spanish dollars, which I afterwards paid him. But this is not all. I was even obliged to send my best pelisse to be sold or pawned in the bazaar at Saida, and to sell to an Albanian soldier 40 English guineas, which my brother had given me on parting at Gibraltar, and which I had saved in the shipwreck. Oh, doctor, about 6 months before Miss Williams's death, I was reduced so low that had she died then, I should not have had money enough to bury her. Musa, one of the best servants I ever had, and who died of the same fever that carried off Miss Williams, out of his own pocket bought oil for 2 or 3 months' consumption without my knowledge, telling Miss W., who afterwards told me that it was not proper milady should send for oil by pints and quarts like poor people, which just then I was compelled to do. Oh, Lord, when I think of it. One day, when I was walking up and down, not knowing how or where to turn, thinking I must shoot my horses from having nothing to feed them with, I heard the jingling of camels' bells, and presently a servant came to say that there were some camels at the gate laden with barley. This seasonable supply for the horses was sent by some strangers who had heard the condition I was in, and the last adley that I had I gave to the camel-driver. Another time, Lady Hester gave me, in writing, a little memorandum of the state of her finances to read, which varies somewhat from her account by word of mouth, although agreeing in the main. It was as follows. My debts began in 1822. From 1822 to 1823. And in a couple of years I owed £3,000, not that I had actually borrowed that sum. I was obliged to take up money, owing to the revolutions in the country. I speak of the time in which there were 3 pashas with an army encamped before the gates of Acre, and when the Emir Bashir, the governor of the mountain, had fled to Egypt, and such a number of persecuted people took refuge under my roof that this caused me great expense. Expecting remittances from England at that time, which I never received, I placed the date of the bonds for the money which I borrowed for only 4 and 6 months, at 25 per cent. This, with their interest and compound interest, and the loss upon the money which I was obliged to take at the price they chose to give it, amounted in 3 years to £3,000. Now God knows what it is. My income would now only simply suffice, after paying the interest of these bonds, to pay my servants and tradespeople, and put a little provision in my house. You must understand that when I drew for my pension upon Constantinople, I paid the dollars at 6 piastres or 6.5. I received them at Beirut at 10.5, and repaid them again in the Matuli country and at Saida, where I got my provisions, at 8.5. Therefore I often lost 100 per cent. The house of Coutts and Company, since old Coutts' death, desired me only to draw my drafts upon them through a merchant's house at Constantinople, and there was a serious loss and inconvenience to me in doing so. It is the custom of this country, when persons cannot pay their debts, to place them under arrest by quartering soldiers upon them, who help themselves to everything that comes in their way until the debt is paid. I was resolved to submit myself to the custom of the country, rather than allow the interference of the English consul at that time, whom I detested. I thought it would save me the trouble of telling my story, and cast the reflection on the English name which it deserved. As things seemed as if they must come to a crisis, if I had no means afforded me to avoid it, I thought the more unequivocal it was the better. For my peace of mind then would not be harassed by the misfortunes of others when I was a beggar myself. The means by which I should become so carried no reproach with them. Therefore, I prepared my mind to submit myself to my fate with them. The only thing that stopped me was I was waiting for an answer respecting the sale of a reversion, and then, if my application did not succeed, I determined to shoot my mares, that they might never fall into other hands, to part with Miss Williams and the rest of my establishment as soon as possible, and to leave this part of the world to be never more heard of, first putting into the hands of my creditors documents to enable them to get all I possessed into their power, and my pension if they could. But this counted for nothing, as English justice and liberality would of course have deprived me of that. Such were my intentions, founded upon a determination not to make any explanation to my family, or receive any more reproaches, as I had already received enough. Whatever I had to say was to be said to the Americans, among whom I thought of going, that they at least might feel convinced that I inherited my grandfather's spirit and high sense of honor, for I never have been in the habit of taking half measures. The number of my servants had been much talked of, but as these people often set off 4 and 5 together in the night, and as several were constantly absent upon leave to look after their families, whilst others were always upon the sick list, giving themselves fevers by overeating, I could not possibly get on with fewer than I had. For 5 men here cannot do the work of 1 in Europe. What are called dragomans and secretaries are a description of persons even worse than the lower class, the idlest and most inefficient of human beings. As for the persecuted people who took refuge at my house, you must have heard, of course, of the revolution in the mountain about 1822. For half a day's journey around me, all the inhabitants abandoned their houses to Turkish and Druze soldiers. I remained alone, tormented to death with miserable fugitives. Terrible storms and an unusual fall of snow destroyed a vast number of houses, and I had only 2 rooms remaining in mine, which were at all habitable. Buildings and walls fell, and all the rest were deluged with water. My health, which was very bad, was rendered worse by the uncommon inclemency of the season, as snow has not been known to have fallen in the lower part of the mountain for 30 years. The cattle died of want, and the next harvest could not be got in for want of beasts of burden. This was enough, and the rest you may imagine. And if you never heard half of this whilst you were in France, you must always recollect that what passes in the interior is but little known upon the coast, and a consul or a merchant by his fireside is little better acquainted with the state of affairs than they are at Marseilles. An old Druze had his head chained to his feet, and was thrown into a dungeon. Several villages, like little towns, were burnt, many women killed, and the property of most of my friends totally destroyed, whilst the unfortunate wives of considerable men were hiding themselves in the snow mountains in disguise, trembling for their infant sons, whose fate, if got hold of, was pretty certain. The two lads, Hannah and Boutros, and one of whom I had the greatest confidence in, were constantly wandering about in search of these unhappy fugitives. I will not say any more. You may judge of my feelings and situation. Such was the rough statement Lady Hester gave me. She alludes in it to the persecuted people who took refuge under her roof, but in her oral communication she never said a word of having afforded an asylum to almost all the Franks in Sicily, who fled to her residence in a panic after the battle of Navarino, and many of whom she lodged and boarded until they could go back in safety. Nor of the 200 wretched beings whom she fed and clothed, housed and protected for nearly 2 years after the sacking of Acre. She never said a word of her numerous acts of beneficence, nor of the indulgent forbearance she showed even to those who had wronged her. Here is an authentic case among 20 similar ones which might be cited. Sheikh Omar Eddin, a puritanical Mussulman, who kept a grocer's shop in Saida, was for many years her purveyor and bailiff, and when, for want of money, she had let her account run up to something considerable, he took her note of hand for the amount, and at the end of the year dunned her for payment. To quiet him, she gave him a fresh note of hand, which he required should be for double the amount. Then he begged of her a quarter of wheat, then another, then an entire piece of broadcloth, then this thing, then that, until he ultimately paid himself twice over. I well recollect, in 1831, when one day I was going down to Saida, Lady Hester's saying to me, "Don't ride the chestnut horse," rather a valuable one, "for if you do, as you must pass Sheikh Omar's shop, he will beg it of me for his son, and I dare not refuse him." This man, on his deathbed, for he died some time during my absence, called his wife and children to his bedside, and said to them, "The cit, my lady, owes me a sum of money. You will find her note of hand among my papers. Burn it. She has ever been a benefactress to me, and if I die with a little property, it is from her generosity. You will here promise me never to urge the claim against her, for I have received double and treble its amount at her hands." They made solemn asseverations, and after his death the eldest son went to Darjeeling and informed Lady Hester Stanhope of their father's dying injunctions. Often did the widow, too, repeat to her how sacred she held them. But it had come to Lady Hester's certain knowledge that notwithstanding all these professions, the duplicity and ingratitude which marked the natives of the country were exemplified in this instance as well as in all others. For the widow had preserved the paper, and had twice attempted to sell it, once to an Englishman and once to a townsman. Notwithstanding this, every year, at the Biram, Lady Hester gave the widow, whom her son's extravagance and inactivity in business had again reduced to narrow circumstances, a handsome sum of money. Lady Hester's exceeding generous and charitable disposition was well known, and she was consequently besieged with tales of distress, with projects of important discoveries which wanted nothing in the world to put them in motion but money, with secrets that could be entrusted only to her, with presents that were always sure to be paid for at treble their value. Her creditors assailed her with letters, messages, visits, and these she was obliged to silence by payments in part and increase of interest. But this was not all. During the Greek Revolution, the Mediterranean was so infested by pirates that it was dangerous for merchants in the Levant to make their remittances to Europe in specie, a state of things which so considerably increased the value of bills of exchange that they were often brought up at a great premium. Yet, in the face of these notorious facts, Signor Blank, a merchant at Beirut, used to cash many of Lady Hester's bills on Messrs. Coutts and Company of London, or on Messrs. Webb and Company of Leghorn, at 35, 25, and 20% discount, when such paper was actually at a premium in the market. Mr. Blank took 15, then 10, then 5% discount. At various periods, likewise, Lady Hester had had severe illnesses. There was no person about her in whom she could put confidence. But Miss Williams, who was totally unacquainted with pecuniary affairs, and of course incapable of remedying the mischief, even if her innocent mind and artless character had not prevented her from suspecting it. At one time, Lady Hester had an Armenian steward, who kept his accounts in his own language. At another time, she had a Piedmontese, who went to Beirut to negotiate the bills, and must have known the nature of such transactions. Who can wonder, therefore, if all her concerns proved ruinous to her, surrounded as she was by adventurers and intriguers? Add to this that various sorts of money are current in Turkey, as many, perhaps as 30, all fluctuating in value, and contributing still more to the complication of her distresses. It would hardly have been a matter of wonder, even under ordinary circumstances, that she should have been plunged into embarrassments. But in the peculiarly perplexing situation in which she was placed, it was unavoidable. End of Chapter 10, Part 1. Chapter 10, Part 2 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 1, edited by Charles Lewis Meryon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 2. I was witness to her signing a list of her creditors' names, with the amount of her various responsibilities, at her request, in case, as she said, anything should befall her, that her creditors might know she never had the smallest intention of defrauding them, even of their usurious and unlawful gains. "When I get the money," she added, "I shall pay them all just double what they lent me, and I think nobody can say that is unjust." All her creditors took 25% for the money they lent. Supposing Lady Hester had not made any difficulty on that head, and was willing to receive pecuniary assistance even at that loss, why, nothing could be said about that matter. Gold was the commodity these merchants had to sell, and they made as much of it as they could, but she did not always get what she had bargained for. Some of the lenders sent a part of the loan in coffee, rice, and in other merchandise. In most cases, the gold was not of full weight, for never was there a country in which money clipping is carried on to a greater extent than in Turkey. And it is not fair to say that Jews are the only usurers. Mussulmans and Christians are just as bad, when the law or other considerations do not coerce them into honesty. Let us take, as an example, a Christian merchant of Beirut. Lady Hester Stanhope wanted to borrow £600, and she applied to Mr. Blank in September 1826, when the exchange was at 20 piastres the Spanish dollar. £200, consequently, are about equal to 1,000 Spanish dollars, and £600 to 3,000 or 60,000 Turkish piastres. Her ladyship drew on Messrs. Coutts and Company for £600 at 1 year's date. The merchant gives her for her bill, instead of 60,000 piastres, only 52,500. That is 17.5 for the dollar instead of 20, which was the real exchange. He gains at once on the transaction 7,500 piastres, or £75. But the bill has a year to run. He, therefore, demands a bonus for his risk, and modestly requires $1,000 or £200. And Lady Hester at last receives £325 for her £600. This sum is paid in adlies of 16 piastres, gazis of 20, rubeas of 9, and sundry other current moneys. But a week or two afterwards, the Pasha issues a tariff, fixing a lower value than the current one on all the coinage of the empire, a step customary every year just before the taxes are gathered, by which the government gains a considerable increase of revenue. This is known to the merchant beforehand, who, having on his books a memorandum of the customary rates at which the money is annually set, or, which is more likely, having for a consideration obtained private information from the government secretaries what money will be rated lowest, takes care to make his rouleaus consist of what he is most desirous of ridding himself of. And Lady Hester finds that what she has received at 20 will only pass at 17 3/4, those at 9 at only 8 1/4, and so on, by which another serious loss is added to all the rest. But in August 1837 her bill is delayed payment because Mr. Coutts and Company have not the certificate of her life for Michaelmas of that year, delayed probably in consequence of Lord Palmerston's measures, and she is compelled to ask time for 6 months more, which is granted on her signing a promissory note for an additional number of dollars in the same usurious proportion. After this statement of her debts, Lady Hester next proceeded to explain how it was she had written to me in such haste to come over to Syria. It has already been mentioned that in 1836 she had been informed by one of her friends in England that a considerable estate had been bequeathed to her, the knowledge of which was concealed from her by those privy to the bequest. The beginning of this erroneous belief seems to date from the spring of 1836. In some letters which passed about that time between her ladyship and the Chevalier Henry Guy, French consul at Beirut, which that gentleman kindly allows me to make use of, and which will best explain her feelings on the subject, it will be seen that she entertained no doubt on the subject, and was firmly persuaded that her friends, for the purpose of forcing her to come to England, kept her in ignorance of her good fortune, thinking that distress must eventually drive her back to her native country. These letters were transmitted to me at Nice, after my manuscript had been sent to England. But the narrative will suffer no interruption by their introduction here, and they serve to corroborate many portions of it. Lady H. Stanhope to the Chevalier Henry Guy, French consul at Beirut. Translated from the French. No date. Monsieur, 1,000 and 1,000 pardons for having delayed so long sending you the bills of exchange. But Logmagi has put off his journey to Beirut from day to day, and I, too, have been in such a bad humor that I could not write. After I had given Eunice the letters, I received one from Saida, from my Lord H., written in such an agitated manner that it cost me 2 days to make it out. The date of it is the 1st of September. Then this date is scratched out, and the month of December is put. He tells me that he went directly to get correct information about my money matters, and that they excused themselves by saying that sometimes they did not know whether I was alive, which was the reason of their being behind in their payments, etc., and such bêtises. About the other affair, he writes nothing at all, only that he gives me to understand, if I wish everything to go on well and as I desire, I must return to England, and then there will be such fine doings, etc., etc. All this does not make me change my mind, but it delays everything. If they won't do me justice, they shall be made to do it by force, by the law. Have the goodness to put the enclosed letter to my Lord H. under cover to Coutts and Company, with a life certificate, for fear the bills of exchange should not be presented soon enough. Now that I enjoy a little quiet, I shall settle all these matters, and all will do well, I hope, in the end. But the excessive folly and blindness of those people astonish me and make me angry, because they place me in a very awkward situation, where I must either be deprived of what is due to me, or hurt their reputations. If this business becomes known in England, it will make a great noise. After having well examined my account, I find I have got left about 400 and odd pounds sterling. Out of the 700 pounds, you have 400 pounds or thereabouts in hand. Make up a bag of $1,000 clear. Keep 200 gazi for things I shall want. Yusef Botal of Alexandria will have a bill of about 2,000 piasters, which I will thank you in due time to pay. Give the rest to Logmagi for commissions, and send me by him some fresh bills of exchange for the 400 pounds sterling. God grant that the time may come when I shall have it in my power to return you in some shape a small measure only of the politeness and attention I have received from you. Be assured, monsieur, of my esteem and friendship. Hester Lucy Stanhope. The same to the same. May 29th, King Charles Day. 2 words more, monsieur, for Dr. Blank, and a letter for Messrs. Coutts, which be good enough to forward. According to the report of a Greek captain, it appears that a cousin of mine, my Lord N., after having stopped a day or 2 at Cyprus, is gone to the Caramanian coast, with the intention of coming here afterwards. I hope he will not come to disturb me in all I have got to say to you. He is the brother of the D. of B., that man who always thwarts me in all my concerns, in the hope of making me quit this country by compulsion. The father of this D. of B. spent for the Bourbons all the time they were in England 25,000 pounds a year. Logmagi has brought me the 6,000 piasters which you have had the goodness to advance me. We will settle all that on your arrival here. In the meantime, monsieur, accept 1,000 thanks and the assurance of my friendship. H. L. Stanhope. The same to the same. No date, but supposed to be June 1836. Monsieur, I am disposed always to put full confidence in you. Here is Coutts' account, such as it is. The letter says nothing, only that so much money has been paid in by such a one, probably an agent of my brother's son, but of that I am not sure. Send me back the account when you have any one coming here. No doubt I owe the payment of this sum to Lord Hardwicke, who does not write until he has finished it all. He is a man who has rendered me 1,000 services, without ever having made them known to me. But chance has brought them to my knowledge. Wait, have a little patience. God is great, and I have right on my side. Tell me if there are any opportunities for Leghorn or France. I wish to write to the doctor. Monday night. Mansour is going to Beirut to do some commissions, but he has such a bad memory that I shall be no gainer by his going in what I have to say to you. I am in want of a drawing for 2 ceilings, one for my divan-room, after your taste and ideas, composed of a circle in the centre and a cornucopia at each corner, the remainder a trellis. There must also be small arcades. These I should like to be ornamented with phyllock flowers. I don't know the French name. The circular centre may have ears of corn, roses, pomegranates. I mean chiefly. My idea of a cornucopia you will see in the annexed sketch. I have just this moment received a very long letter from Madame de Ferriat, who is delighted with the permission I have given her to come to me. She is making her preparations, is selling her property, etc. I fancy she must be a woman quite unique. I will write again on Sunday, But before you let me hear from you, will you make some inquiries about the character of a Florentine who has written to me? Let me know what kind of a man he is, what he is good for. I can never get through all my business with Mansour alone. Still, those Franks are generally detestable. His name is Renicucci, or something like that. Forgive me for troubling you so much, and accept, monsieur, the sentiments of my regard and respect. Hester Lucy Stanhope. Friday, 3 o'clock. My express goes off now. For the divan-room of Madame F., I should like ornaments of a musical character, flowers, etc., for she seems to be very fond of music and the fine arts. Let me know whether the Spanish carpenter is out of employ just at present. The same to the same. June 18th, 1836. Monsieur, your letter came to me the 17th in the evening, and it is with pleasure that I see the extent of the interest you are good enough to take in my affairs. Therefore, you will be pleased to learn that what I intended to do will probably be no longer necessary. Very extraordinary circumstances have come to my knowledge, which I cannot communicate to you by letter. I am neither afraid of plague nor of anything else. So if you believe, as I do, that everything is destiny, I should like to have an opportunity of profiting by your counsel touching certain things somewhat incredible, which have been twice repeated to me by persons much attached to me, but who are desirous of not being known. Now I must speak to you about my money concerns. In the course of 15 or 20 days, I should like to have 3 letters of exchange for $1,000. If you have not the money by you, you can give the bills to some of the English merchants, with whom I will not have anything to do, because they wish to have all my bills, or none at all. And as I see that my affairs are likely to be bettered, I shall have nobody but you. You served me well in my misfortunes, and I wish you to see the end of them. As I fear my letters may be stopped if my handwriting were known, I will thank you to direct one of them to Mr. A. Kinglake, adding the name of your banker at Paris or Marseilles. I have left that one open. You will be good enough to seal it, and put it, as well as the other, to my Lord Hardwicke, under cover, directed to one of your friends in England. Adieu, monsieur, and pray accept the assurance of my esteem and friendship. Hester Lucy Stanhope. P.S. I have kept back my letter a day longer, having had an express from Beirut, to inform me that a medallion belonging to me has been found at Cyprus, another proof of the robberies committed in my house. However, for the present say nothing about it until they have caught the man who sold it. End of Chapter 10, Part 2. Chapter 10, Part 3 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 1, edited by Charles Louis Meryon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 3. The Same to the Same. July 3rd, 1836. Monsieur, I intended to have written to you yesterday when your letter reached me, to have told you that I have found out still more robberies and such intrigues, but say nothing for the present. Only I foresee I shall be put to great expense every way. And if it does not inconvenience you to wait for the amount of the bill that was protested until the £2,000 are paid into your banker's hands, it would considerably advance my business. I have had farther accounts about the money concealed from me. Very good. When I get it, I shall give you plenty of commissions for France. How kind you are to think about my eyesight, which sickness and trouble have so injured. Nevertheless, it is better than it was last year. I will send you back the book by the express who will go for the money. What day would you like he should be with you? Half of what the writer says is incorrect. Before I went to Palmyra, I made an excursion into the desert with Lascaris alone, keeping the doctor and the married servants, under one pretext or another, from accompanying me. Lascaris and I were pursued by the Fedan Bedouins, who were hostile to Mohammed el-Fadi, and although our horses never drank for 2 days, we rode from 10 in the morning until after midnight, without eating or drinking, to get out of their district. Then again, the dispute between Lascaris and me was about a groom, who, not knowing who he was, would not let him enter my stables at Hama. His pride would not stop to listen to reason, and he ran away. Il s'est enfui. I met him several years afterwards at Tripoli, and he made me cry for an hour by the excess of his grief and the excuses which he made me. So much so that I, who hardly ever shed tears, was astonished at myself. Poor man! There indeed was a true courtier, with the most elegant manners, and an inconceivable fund of knowledge without pedantry. It was not Napoleon that he was so much attached to. It was to him who had the portefaix. You know very well what he did for him. Accept, monsieur, the expression of my esteem and regard. Hester Lucy Stanhope. The same to the same, June, August 14th, 1836. Monsieur, I have succeeded at last in finding out the extent of the intrigues against me. The intriguers thought to do me a great deal of harm, but thank God they have done me a great deal of good, as you will see hereafter. When the hot days are over, you must pay me another visit, in order for me to make you perfectly acquainted with everything, and also to settle our accounts. Be not uneasy if you do not receive any letters from your correspondent by the packet-boat. At this season all the great folks in England are dispersed at their country houses, and your friend perhaps will defer writing to you until he gets your last letters. I have as yet no answer from the doctor since I last wrote to him, but I understand his circumstances are not very flourishing. Poor man, let him take courage. He shall be better. I shall be well off when I have put down those blank. In 8 days, with your leave, I will send you the bill of exchange for the £100, and you can send me the 200 gazi. I shan't torment you any more afterwards until I make you my principal banker and attorney to liquidate my debts, etc. Accept, etc., Hester Lucy Stanhope. P.S. The Negro affair has not annoyed me much, but the infamous conduct of those two maids torments me daily. One of them has driven her father-in-law from his home, and the other has been turned out of doors by the man's wife where she lived. I have always found that giving too much education was only painting a character over, and that, needs must, whatever is born in man will, sooner or later, show itself. Too much education is what has spoiled France, and has made the French monkey philosophers and the English wicked brutes, qui ont rendu les François des singes, filous et les Anglais des méchants bêtes. The Same to the Same. October, 1836. Monsieur, I cannot but think how kind you are to me, not even to forget my business when the presence of such a distinguished personage requires all your attention. But you are equal to it all. Would to heaven that the prince was aware how much France owes you. Indeed, he cannot fail of knowing it during his cruise in the Levant, where everybody esteems you so much. But I must hold my tongue, else you may be angry with me. Have the goodness to deliver the money sealed up to Eunice. Enclosed are the bills of exchange, and the letter which you allowed me to read. The Same to the Same, June, October 30th, 1836. Monsieur, hardly was I recovered from my migraine and inflammation in my eyes, when, lo, all my people fall ill, the little black girl and all, and I have been tormented and tired to death, but thank God they are now all well again. I have delayed writing to you, expecting always to have letters by the steamer, but when I reflect on it, I doubt if I shall receive any until Parliament meets. At least that will be the excuse, and they will say that everybody is just now out of town. It will be curious to see how they will prove their right to conceal from me that money had been left me. I understand clearly that there are two legacies. One I have been informed of by an indirect but a very certain channel since I saw you, a considerable one and a small one. If I were spiteful, I could make them repent of their doings in a court of justice. But even as it is, the matter cannot be passed over without creating some noise in the world. I have twice advised Mr. Coutts that I should draw on him, after the 10th of October, both for my pension and the £950 which fell due in September, and after the repeated assurances which they have made, that in future they will be punctual in their payments, I can't think they will play me any more tricks, especially when they have so much to do for me since the discovery which I have made. Therefore, will you let me know if you have money enough by you to cash a bill of £300 before the money from England comes to hand? Of that amount, I wish you to keep 200 gazi for expenses. Lady Hester now told me that, having written ineffectually to a nobleman on the subject, she had turned over in her thoughts where she could find a fit person, in whom she could confide, to ascertain the truth of these matters, and to whom she could write, with the request that he would make the necessary inquiries. She had deliberated a long while whether it should be a lawyer, a man of business, or one of her old friends. Among the latter, from first to last, she added, I have thought Sir Francis Burdett would be the one I could most assuredly confide in. In speaking of him, she said, "He is a man of feeling, doctor, and he and I were always the best of friends. I recollect, when I told him how basely 2 or 3 people had behaved on Mr. Pitt's death, he was ready to go beside himself. His hand went into the breast of his waistcoat and out again, as if he could not contain his indignation. What do you think? Would not he be the proper person? I always said Sir Francis was no democrat. He threw himself into the hands of the people merely that he might have an excuse of business to be out or by himself. All the democrats that I have known were nothing but aristocrats at heart, aye, and worse than others. Even Horne Tooke was not a democrat. That I am sure of, by the court he always paid me, and by his constantly making so many civil speeches to me and of me. I have never known a man yet, if he was not to be bought, that was not a democrat from personal motives." In fine, it was resolved to write to Sir Francis, and a rough copy of a letter was drawn up by Lady Hester's dictation, which, after some verbal alterations, she thought would do. Several remarks, quite foreign to the subject, were introduced, announcing the researches she had made as to the Eastern origin of the Irish and Scotch. And as Lady Hester kept constantly saying to me, "Will this letter do? Do you see anything that wants altering?" a question very usual with her when dictating letters, I forgot Gil Blas's warning, and very distinctly expressed my apprehensions lest the introduction of the opinions about the affinity of the Irish and the Koresh should make Sir F. think her cracked. For, I observed, his studies most probably have never led him to investigate these subjects, which, thus introduced into a letter on business, might be made a handle for the ill-natured comments of people who disliked her. She thanked me, but retained them all, and only requested me to write them out fair. I did so, and inadvertently skipped a page, which, when the sheet was full, created some confusion in reading it. So resolving to rewrite it, I merely submitted it to Lady Hester's perusal, whilst I rode down to see my family. But I was there seized with a phlegmonous inflammation of my leg, which in one night, from the irritation of the stirrup leather, rudely made, as it always is in Turkey, assumed so alarming a character, and was so painful, that I took to my bed and kept it 11 days. I wrote a note to Lady Hester, describing my situation, requesting her to send me the letter to Sir F. in order that I might write it over again. But hearing that I suffered a great deal, she said it was not necessary, and sealing the copy she had got, she dispatched it by a foot messenger to Beirut to go out by the steamboat. September 12th. We were thus occupied until this day, with the exception of the many hours passed by Lady Hester in diatribes on women and their husbands, she endeavoring to prove that in almost all possible cases women should be simple automatons, moved by the will and guidance of their masters. Her fertile memory brought a vast number of cases to bear on her argument, cases which she had seen in high life during her time, where gentlemen, otherwise of estimable character, became the ridicule of society from suffering themselves to be ruled by their wives. But Lord F. was the one whose example she dwelt upon most strenuously. "Women," she would say, "must be one of three things. Either they are politicians and literary characters, or they must devote their time to dress, pleasure, and love. Or lastly, they must be fond of domestic affairs. I do not mean by domestic affairs a woman who sits working at her needle, scolding a couple of children, and sending her maid next door to the shop for all her wants. There is no trouble in that. What I mean is a yeoman's wife, who takes care of the butter and cheese, sees the poultry yard attended to, and looks to her husband's comfort and interest. As for the advantage of passing your evenings with your family, which you urge as a reason for having them near you," she remarked, "all sensible men that I have ever heard of take their meals with their wives, and then retire to their own room to read, write, or do what they have to do, or what best pleases them. If a man is a fox hunter, he goes and talks with his huntsman or the grooms, and very good company they are. If he is a tradesman, he goes into his shop. If a doctor, to his patients. But nobody is such a fool as to moulder away his time in the slip-slop conversation of a pack of women." I happened to observe that many clever men had not only passed their hours with their families, but even studied and wrote surrounded by them, and I named 4 or 5 that occurred to my recollection, one of whom was C. Did you ever hear me say there were not more fools than one in the world? She rejoined. As for Mr. C. I knew him, so you need not talk to me about him. Mrs. C. There was a woman. Charles C. was one of the greatest roues in London, always drunk. He was in the blues, and took it into his head to fall in love with a right honourable, very ugly, but her relations would not let her marry him. Perhaps he wanted her money. He was very agreeable. Mr. C. lived in a very hugger-mugger sort of a way, with a maid of all work and a boy, and it was his daughter who did most things for him. Perhaps he was not rich enough to have another room to study in. In this sort of way would Lady Hester Stanhope argue on most subjects, running from one thing to another, and then, when you thought she had lost sight of her text, returning to it with some pithy observation, which generally settled the point to her own satisfaction. September 29th. I remained at Mar Elias, confined with my bad leg, from the 13th until this day, when I returned to June. Letters and messengers had, in the interim, been passing between M. Guy and Lady Hester Stanhope respecting a house which he was employed to hire for me and my family. But I had reason to think afterwards that she had no wish to get rid of us, as the house was reserved for the Baroness de Feria, and the correspondence could tend to no other purpose than to throw odium upon Mrs. as a discontented and capricious woman. During my confinement, Lady Hester Stanhope wrote the following letter to my daughter, then hardly out of her childhood. To Miss Tuesday, before sunset, September 19th, 1837. I was pleased to find, my dear little Eugenia, that you inherit your father's good will towards me. I must thank you and Mademoiselle Longchamp for your kind offers of assistance, but I must decline them, having taken a determination not to have anything more to do with the doctor's family than if it did not exist in the country. I should forget my situation and rank in life were I to condescend to dispute and make daily explanations to my inferiors. To avoid this, I must give up all thoughts of making your acquaintance, although you are an object of interest to me, as would be all the children of the doctor, even if he had 100. Request him not to think about my letters or anything else that relates to me. Only let him take care of his health. If I can be useful to a sick person, nothing is unpleasant to me. But when I cannot, or rather am not permitted to be, the history of the progress of sores is not very agreeable. I do not wish to hear of him till he is recovered. Writing must fatigue him, and I would rather be without letters from you or him. I have had a letter from M. Guy to-day, in which he tells me he was thinking of taking a ride to see some houses to hire for your family. I shall send to Beirut on Thursday, before daylight, and the doctor's letters will go by that messenger. He had better write a few lines more to M. Guy to explain what situation and what sort of house he would like, as it would appear that I am grown a fool in my old age, and neither know my right hand from my left. The doctor is aware that he may command anything my house contains which may be useful to him, but I shall neither send him anything, nor inquire after him, as my messenger was thus ill received. And I do not think I can be called upon to put my eyes out by writing, when I more than want the sight I have left for my own affairs. Believe me, dear little girl, yours sincerely, H.L.S. The frame of Lady Hester's mind at this period may be further understood from the following letter, which was sent to me with a secret injunction to read it to my wife. To Dr. Blank, at Mar Elias, June, September 23rd, 1837. Whilst waiting for M. Guy's answer, I have some remarks to make, worthy of your attention. I do not speak in wrath, my dear doctor, but I do not see how, at this period, you are to help yourself, and it is plain to perceive that you will not be able in any way to accomplish the objects you came for. Therefore, I should deem it as an act of folly to stick you up as a sort of mascara in the public eye at Beirut, merely to write a few letters. The whole of my business M. Guy offered to undertake before I sent for you, and to come here and write for me. But I had reasons for wishing you to come, which no longer exist. For under no circumstances do I see that you would be comfortable near me, nor should I wish for it, either at present or in the future. Therefore, if you like to pass the winter at Cyprus, where perhaps you would be more comfortable than at Beirut, you are at full liberty to do so. When my affairs are settled, you might then, if Cyprus pleases you, purchase a little terre there, or return to Europe as you like best. I am very glad that you wrote to M. Guy yourself, for I had described a country house near some village, and you have described a sort of coffee-house near the gate of town. You talked to me of Mrs. Blank's great love of retirement, which I laughed at the time, and therefore she chooses a house upon the high road. But leave all that childish, vulgar stuff. I do not wish for a hasty answer, as this subject requires reflection. Try and make yourself comfortable, and I shall find means of settling my business to my satisfaction. Only I must have a clear and distinct answer, that I may make arrangements accordingly. Yours sincerely, Hester Lucy Stanhope. P.S. Should my messenger retard, it is for M. Gee to be able to answer your letter about the house. I enclosed your 2 letters to be forwarded to England. Do not fidget yourself about me. I have made many awful sacrifices in my life. Surely I can make a small one when I know what it is. This is what distinguishes the truly great from the low and vulgar. On returning to the Dar, I remained there 8 days. Our conversations turned principally, during this period, on her father's seat at Chevening, the people in that neighborhood, and the happiness of her early days there. She recollected the names of all the gentry thereabouts, of the farmers, as also of her father's servants, and could tell anecdotes respecting them with such a minuteness of particulars that the individuals, to their surprise, after the lapse of so many years, would have found she remembered more of them than they did of themselves. End of Chapter 10, Part 3. Read by PhyllisV. End of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 1, edited by Charles Lewis Meryon.